I had a chance to give both messages today. I gave in the Bible study, I gave Nature and Nurture Part 1, and in this message I'm going to give Nature and Nurture Part 2. Those of you familiar with my presentations know that these two subjects are related, but they stand alone. So if you did not hear Part 1, that's okay. You can always maybe download it later off our website. But we're going to talk about Nature and Nurture Part 2. We're going to focus more on nurture. We're going to focus more on the environment, our environment. Nature talks more about our heredity. Now we're going to talk about our environment. So I want to talk about our family environment. Let's turn to Deuteronomy chapter 6. There's environment's huge. Work environment, neighborhood environment, friends environment, church environment. There's a lot to do with environment that can shape us. And of course, environment can shape us for good or for bad. Right now we're presently in a cycle with social media and so much communication going on that there's a civil war of ideas going on in our land today. Many disagreements stoked by people who are wanting money and power. There's a lot of fighting going on, and it's really sad because some subjects you can't even discuss with people, even people that you're somewhat close to. Some families can't discuss certain items, and certainly even I don't want to go into details today or opinions today, but even the coronavirus, there's a lot of discussion about that. There's many people I could talk to, like the entire interactive Bible study, we were all on the same page. And so I can talk to some people where we're on the same page, but yet there are other people, you can get into disagreements over and can get irritable toward each other. We don't want to do that. So there's a lot to be said about environment or nurture. When you take something, trying to nurture something. And let me show you the value of a family environment. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 7. This is what the law taught about a family environment. He said the words he commanded those days should be taught to the children. And this is verse 7. You teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. Is when you talk about the way of God, the instructions of God, or whatever instructions you want your children to have, whatever traits you want your children to have, you can influence that. You can influence it based by your environment. I say that because I do believe nature is stronger than nurture, and there are certain things about nature, kind of like I believe in corporal punishment. I believe there's a time for spanking, there's a time for correction within a family. But I want to caution those of you, again, not our audience here, we're pretty older people, but if you happen to be listening in and you're younger, you want to be careful not to overuse too much corporal punishment or too much discipline, because you could be ending up trying to change something that's really, you've given them in your genes, you've given them a part of the heredity, and you can overplay the correction. I know too many parents underuse the correction, I get that. But you don't want to go to either extreme of either not having enough correction, but you don't want too much correction where you're fighting something. You've created this trait, you've created this human being. They act the way they do because you act who you are, and you can't then use corporal punishment to try to change something that may not be the best approach to changing. But what we want to do is we want to teach. We want to spend time teaching diligently. And what messages, as those are parents, what messages do you want to teach your children? What do you talk about? And there's a lot of talking informal, there's a lot of instruction that goes on informally. I get to spend some time watching my 4-year-old grandson. I mention that from time to time, and I mentioned that last week again in Tennessee when I was up there. And one lady came up to me, she said, I really liked the sermon, but I really liked it when you talked about you and your grandson. So that really struck home to her. But with a grandson, it's the informal conversations a lot of times. When I'm around him, I help teach him math, not by reciting numbers, but I use every opportunity to talk about math. When I'm driving down the road, he's in the car, we talk about the speed limit. And I talk about how, look at that, numbers there, and numbers, and we talk about temperature, we talk about numbers, we talk about distance to the sun. I'm always showing him how math is an everyday thing. It's just what you talk about regularly. And of course, some of us talk a lot, so we have many of opportunities to share thoughts and ideas. and some people are more shy and don't talk as much. But we do want to take the time to talk when we lie down with someone. I remember when he was young, and I would lie down with him when he went to sleep for a nap. And those are beautiful talks. Some of the greatest talks in the world are when you're lying down to sleep with a small child, or when you're driving to a church function with teenagers. Like if you're driving 2 hours to a basketball tournament, or you're driving 3 hours to whitewater rafting, coming home in that van, packed with teenagers, you have the greatest conversation. Sometimes you even hear things that the parents wish you wouldn't hear, because the kids are tired, they're having a lot of fun, and it's just open conversation. They'll ask different questions. And of course, you never want to ever put the parents in bad light, but you get to hear many things. But you want to talk. You want to talk about these things. Look at 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5. I mentioned in the Bible study in 2 Timothy 1, verse 5, I mentioned how the Apostle Peter had some what I consider nature traits. And then I was talking also about how Timothy had some nature traits. But I mentioned in the Bible study last hour how it's hard to determine how much of these are actually nature and how much are nurture. In other words, look at this. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5. When it talks about Timothy, when he's complimenting Timothy's faith, the Apostle Paul is writing to Timothy, complimenting Timothy's faith. Then he says, I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you. That you have faith. Timothy, I've noticed you have faith. But then he says, it's also dwelt in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice. So again, I don't know how much of Timothy's faith was from nature, and I was showing that was a possibility in the Bible study, but we also know nurture would be a big part of it. That what type of example did Lois and Eunice set for young man Timothy? Baby Timothy, young man Timothy, young child Timothy, teenager Timothy, young adult Timothy. What type did it say? So it's a mixture. It's going to be a mixture of things that were given by genes, by heredity, and also environment. Now the thing is, once we've given the genes to our kids, that part's done. Now the rest of our life we spend trying to give them the heredity. The environment. We try to give them the environment. We try to set up the environment to teach them. And sometimes I think about what I passed on to my family. I think, I'm sorry that I passed on certain natural traits to you, but let me try to give you some advice of things now you could possibly change to work with those traits. In other words, if we as parents are impatient and if we pass that on, or if we as parents are stubborn and we pass that on, then we want to spend time trying to help them to be more patient and to be less stubborn. And again, I know you're not going to throw stones at me, because I can easily throw stones right back at you, because you're a human being just like me. You've passed on traits to your kids that you wish you hadn't, and you also have tried to set up an environment to help your kids. So there are consequences, family consequences. Let's look at Exodus chapter 20. I remember there was one time a friend of mine, Exodus 20 verses 4 through 6. It was really funny. A friend of mine who attended one of the other Church of God congregations came, and they weren't used to my style. Part of my style is sometimes I ask questions in the sermon that I don't answer. I'll ask questions in the sermon that I don't answer. Now, you know why I do that, because I want you to think. I want you to think about it. And so afterwards, this lady came up to me. She said, Mr. Havir, you asked a question, you didn't give us the answer. And I said, that's right. And she said, and you're not going to give me the answer now, are you? I said, that's right. But it kind of floored her a little bit, because she was used to authoritative people speaking from the pulpit who would tell them what they strongly believed, and maybe even trying to tell them what to think. So I'm proposing something to you. I want you to think. I don't know exactly what this means. It's in verse 5. It's given in the second commandment. It's given in the second commandment, talking about you shall not have graven images, because you should not bow down to graven images. We get that part. That's not the part that's hard to understand. You shall not bow down to them nor serve them. Now here's what he says. I, the Lord your God, I'm a jealous God. No problem understanding that. Now here's what you can have a great discussion about. Visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation. Now take some discussion. And we're not going to spend a lot of time discussing it, but I'm going to drop some seeds here for you to think about. Does that mean that the reaction and the consequence is definitely all the way to the third and fourth generation? Is that something that God designed to happen, or is that something that happens? In other words, I understand consequences of family. That's what I'm mentioning here. That if your grandparents were bad with money, there's a chance your parents were bad with money, and there's a chance that you'll be bad with money. That happens. There are some people, where you're born, what jobs you have. There are some families that will send all their kids to college. College isn't the answer for everybody, but education is, and growing and learning is. But let's put it this way. There's some families that value learning, and there's some families that don't value learning. And of course, no matter what kind of learning you do, whether it be a trade, whether it be a business, whether it be college, whether it be a trade school, my approach is, as long as you're valuing learning, that's the key, not necessarily exactly what you have to do in your learning. But in other words, if you're born into a family that never knew how to spend money, never knew how to buy quality things, there's a likelihood that that'll be passed on. Now, that can change through outside influences, but the point is that can happen. We know that happens. But is this, when it says here, visiting the iniquity of the third and fourth generation, is that ordained to happen? In other words, is that going to happen no matter what circumstances occur? That's the part I'm not going to talk to you about. I want you to think about it. I want you to think about that phrase, iniquity, consequences to the third and fourth generation. Does that mean if my grandfather sinned that I'm suffering the consequence of his sin? And is that ordained of God? Or is that just like gravity, it happens? You can think about that. But no matter what your conclusion is on that is, here's what I want you to realize. There are family consequences. That part I am saying, there are family consequences. The details of those family consequences, you can have some great discussions about. But there are family consequences. Now, I do want you to look at Ezekiel 18. Ezekiel 18, because I do want to show that while there are family consequences, maybe family curses, maybe family penalties, you've got to sort through that yourself. Ezekiel chapter 18, I do want to show you that even in the Old Testament, I say even in the Old Testament because people will give this a New Testament reaction or a New Testament conclusion. But even in the Old Testament, this conclusion was set. In the book of Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 4 and verse 20, it says, "Behold, all souls are mine, the soul of the Father as well as the soul of the Son. The soul that sins shall die." Verse 20 says, "The soul that sins shall die." So even though we looked at the concept to the third and fourth generation, Ezekiel 18 shows out that there are personal consequences. And what he shows in verses 4 through 9, that families take on personal responsibility. Verse 4, "The soul that sins shall die, but if a man is just and does what is lawful and right, if he has not eaten on the mountains, if he's nor lifted up his eyes to the idols of the house of Israel, nor defiled his neighbor's wife, nor approached a woman during her impurity, if he has not oppressed anyone, but has restored to the debtor his pledge, has robbed no one by violence, but has given his bread to the hungry and covered the naked with the clothing, if he has not exacted usury, nor taken any increase, but has withdrawn his hand from iniquity and executed true judgment between man and man, if he has walked in my statutes and kept my judgments faithfully, he is just, he shall surely live, says the Lord." Okay? So he's basically showing personal consequences. Verses 10 through 13 show a disobedient son. If you have a son who is a robber, and then goes on to explain the bad qualities, when your children make mistakes, verse 13, his blood is on him. Now in verses 14 through 17, if you beget a son who does the right things, then he will not suffer for you being a bad parent. So the point he's basically saying is, if you've made mistakes in rearing children, They suffer the consequences for their mistakes. You don't suffer the consequences for their mistakes. On the other hand, if your kids do better than you do, they receive the benefits for their good behavior, and you receive the problems, you receive the consequences for your mistake. So again, there are family consequences, and so how can a person overcome his family consequences? By doing the right thing. So again, I guess the question is, can you overcome a family consequences in the second generation? Or does it take that third and fourth generation for it to overcome those consequences? Okay, how can a parent affect the children by nurturing them? How can you affect a child by nurturing them? Let's look at Proverbs chapter 19, verse 18. Because Dave, if I'm thinking about, you talk about nature, and if you talk about my child stubborn, and if you talk about my child is impatient, and if you talk about my child's loud, and if you talk about my child is pushy, or you talk about my child being compliant, you talk about my child being detail-minded, you talk about my child being organized, friends and family, do you realize a lot of that was set up outside of your good child rearing or bad child rearing? The nature of a person is very important. Now, even though if we can't totally affect the nature of that, we have to let God do that. I wish I'd organized my presentation to spend more time on that in the Bible study. But if God is the one who helps change the nature of someone, what can we do? We can change the nurture. We can nurture them. Proverbs 19:18. Proverbs 19, verse 18. Chasten your son while there is hope, and do not set your heart on his destruction. The sooner you can work with traits, the better. You can work on certain traits easier at age 1 than you can at age 54, or age 12, or age 16, or age 18 or 20, depending on the circumstances of your child. So you want to help someone while there is hope with your children. Now, by the way, we're going to cover here in a minute, we nurture each other too. We just don't nurture our children. We nurture each other. And so if you're working with someone who's an alcoholic and you're trying to help them become a recovering alcoholic, and they may be age 45, there's still hope. And how well can you nurture them? How well can you help them? You have to understand the nature of it, that we can't change. We have to let God help change that through the power of His Spirit and the promises He's made. But then how can we nurture someone? Let's look at Luke chapter 15. We talk about helping someone while there's hope. So again, we try to nurture a child. We try to nurture a grandchild. And we don't ever give up hope, but sometimes some ages are harder, some cycles are harder, some situations are harder. But you know the story of Luke 15, verses 11 through 32. It's called the prodigal son. A certain man had 2 sons. The younger said of his father, "Give me the portion of the goods that falls to me," and he divided them his livelihood. The dad had 2 sons, older boys, having the life of their own, and Dad gave their inheritance early. Now, it is your responsibility to decide how quickly you give an inheritance to your children or to your grandchildren. You know, some people don't mess with it. Some people don't do anything about it, and quite frankly, that can be a real nuisance for the child. In other words, if someone's older and doesn't think about it at all, it really handicaps the younger parent, or even the parent who's getting older. Some people are really good at mapping out inheritance. They're really good about that. Their advantage is, if you give things too early, what happened here to this guy? He blew it. He blew it on women. Probably blew it on booze. That would be hard to take. I'm a tightwad. That would be hard to take. If I had a lot of money, I passed it on to my kids and watched them blow it. That would be hard. That would really be hard for me. I would have to take on the tone of this dad, this righteous dad here. I personally believe, that's my opinion now, I like to give things away as some ahead of time to give them a start in life, and also to watch how they use it, to encourage them to use it well. I guess I would say I don't think I'd give it all to them early, nor would I keep it all to after I die. I'd want to pass things on a little bit ahead of time. Now, I have to understand I don't have a big inheritance, okay? But, and I have to say I just lived through my in-laws, who are really wonderful people, but they hoarded things. And my wife kept saying, well, actually my mother-in-law kept saying to my father-in-law, let's start getting rid of some of this stuff so it's not all on Pam to do. My mother-in-law got it. But my father-in-law said, no, she'll enjoy having all this stuff. And he was wrong. He was wrong, because we still haven't disposed of everything. We're trying to dispose of things, wisely, and even just passing things on. Now, I don't own a lot, but I've already passed on things. Simple things like, even though I haven't played golf in years, I've already given David my golf clubs. I guess if I ever want to play golf, I can borrow the clubs. The desk that Carl Aikens made for me, and of course our son Jonathan worked for Carl Aikens, so I've already passed that desk on to Jonathan, because he worked for Carl, he had a connection with Carl, and he has it. So I'm already passing things on. The one thing, I am not a hoarder at all. Well, I shouldn't say at all, but I'm not a hoarder in principle, and so I'm happy to pass things. What am I going to have in this life? I live good, I live comfortably, I have good friends, I have a great job, around a lot of people. I know the great God in heaven. So, to me, it's like I'm not going to hold on. When I die, it's not like they're going to wonder, what do I do with this? They're already getting it now. They say, well, Dave, you're not talking about valuable things. No, I'm not. These are not valuable things. But I'm the type of, I like to see, enjoy this. And again, sometimes if I can use a little money to help them go on a trip of a lifetime, I'll be happy to kick in a little money to help them go on a trip of a lifetime. And again, so I get to watch them enjoy. If they want to make a special trip, here, do this, That, again, you decide, by the way, if you want to just wait to leave it in a will and you just pass it on when you die, that's your business. If you want to give things to them in advance, that's your business. The point is here, we do get to affect our older children. We do get to affect them. It's not always easy when they're older children. They have minds of their own, they have lives of their own, but we can nurture them. You don't nurture a 40-year-old or a 45-year-old the same way that you nurture a 3-year-old. But you can still nurture people. And I can think about it in the congregation. I want to nurture you in my job. While I want to recognize your nature. I want to recognize if you're just bullheaded, stubborn, I maybe can't do anything about that. God made you that way, and your parents made you that way, and I've got to deal with it. But I can try, if I recognize you're bullheaded, stubborn, how can I nurture you? What kind of influence can I be on you? And that's what you toward me, and that's what we are toward each other. So I'm saying you can affect people, your own children, but let's spend some time. How can people affect adults by nurturing them? Let's look at a couple quick scriptures. Matthew chapter 20. Matthew chapter 20, verses 25 through 28. This scripture has been read a lot in the last 20 years, not so much recently, but it's so true. If you're a leader, you cannot exercise authority over people. You might say, wait a second, Dave. Wait a minute. That's the way all churches are set up. Okay, that means if they're not following Christ, that's their problem. It doesn't matter if everyone's doing it. Just because everyone's doing it doesn't make it right. We either do what Christ said or we can do what everyone else does. The rulers of the Gentiles lord it over people. You do not nurture people by lording it over them. You do not deal with them by exercising great authority over them. Now you can say, well, our church literature says this, or our leader says that, or well, Jesus Christ says this. Yoo-hoo, Jesus Christ, I'm quoting Christ, red letter. But all the churches do it. Yoo-hoo, it doesn't matter what all the churches do. Well, even the Church of God churches do this. So, Jesus Christ said, you do not lord it over people. Then he talked how he came to serve them, and he wanted to be their slave. So to nurture people, you have to then not use the authority approach to nurture them. Again, now with children, you have a certain amount of authority, especially when they're small. How about husbands? No, you should not be lording it over your wife with authority. Yet you say, well, I know a lot of religious families who do that. I believe in Ephesians 5, but I believe in Ephesians 5 is not trump this. We have to read Ephesians 5 in relationship to this. They have to work together. Because you can't have husbands lording it over their wives. That's not the way it should be. And if you think I'm wrong about that, you're in for a rude awakening when you talk to the Messiah later on. You're in for a rude awakening when you find out he really meant what he said here. Now let's look at 2 Corinthians 10, verses 1 and 2. I have to go fast here. 2 Corinthians 10, verses 1 and 2. Paul showed an approach, and I've said through the years, this approach works especially when you're dealing with unconverted people, when you're dealing with converted people, righteous people. And I do say this to our teachers in the audience, this approach does not work with teachers. Okay? Teachers, you have to be bold early, and then you can lessen it up. Because if you're too gentle early, they'll walk all over you, you set a bad pattern. Every time I say that, the teachers all verify that. But the approach we have in life, for most cases, Paul sought to be meek and gentle, and when he couldn't be meek and gentle, he was bold. So there's a time for boldness. But you start out with meek and gentle. To nurture someone, you start out with meek and gentle. Look at Galatians 6:1. Galatians 6:1. Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of gentleness. If you want to nurture someone, you use gentleness wherever possible. Now you might say, well, Dave, what if gentleness doesn't work? Well, your either option is, if gentleness doesn't work, you can either go to boldness or you can let it be. You can go to boldness, or you can look to Father and say, I don't think I want to try boldness here, because I want it to work, and I want it to be edifying. And I know the Bible says gentleness first, then boldness, but sir, I'm going to give it to you because I think I'll let you do the boldness. I don't think I have to be the bold one just because it says I can be bold. But so many people, they want to fix things so badly that, first of all, many people don't ever start with gentleness. They go straight to boldness. And some people would never even consider, not even, why even do the boldness? Oh, I got to fix them. Really? Is it really your place are you the spiritual one to fix them? Are you who are spiritual, fix them with gentleness if you can. Now again, there is a time for boldness, but boy, people overplay that hand a lot. They overplay that one a lot. 3 John chapter 1, verses 9 through 12. Let me contrast two people here. You've heard the names before. 3 John chapter 1, verses 9 through 12. Two people here in 3 John. What a contrast. Verse 9, he says, I wrote to the church about Diotrephes. Diotrephes loved to have the preeminence over them. Friends, when I see someone who wants to have the preeminence over me, I take note of that with alarm bells, and I'm out. In other words, I'm not going to give them control over me. Someone who seeks to have preeminence over me, forget it. I'll be polite to them, but I'm not giving them preeminence over. I'm not going to do it. And he had malicious words, and he would not receive the brethren, and he would throw them out of the church. And this is a bad example of throwing people out of the church. Now then he says, don't imitate this evil. So when I see someone acting like Diotrephes, and someone can say, well, that guy's been a minister for 40 years. I don't care. He's acting like Diotrephes. I'm not going to imitate Diotrephes. I'm not going to subject myself to Diotrephes. I'm not going to imitate Diotrephes. I'm out. Now then verse 12 says, Demetrius has a good testimony from all. From the truth itself, we bear witness, and you know our testimony is true. So friends, consider Diotrephes, consider Demetrius, and be a nurturer like Demetrius. Again, there's a time to be bold, there's a time to be certainly instructive, but do not have the approach of Diotrephes. I guess we'll conclude. I'm looking at my time. Let's look at 2 Corinthians 1, verses 3 through 5. 2 Corinthians 1, verses 3 through 5. The Bible is full. The Bible is absolutely full of great instructions of how to help people, how to nurture people. So you saw that I spent time, a few minutes talking about how you nurture your children, but how do you nurture a widow? And how do you nurture a person going through midlife crisis? And how do you nurture someone who's had surgery and is really feeling badly about themselves? And how do you nurture someone who needs surgery and is scared? And how do you nurture someone who's lost a job? And how do you nurture someone who hates their job? See, so there's the nature part, which I really can't control. But the nurture part I can control. I can control what I do, and you can control what you do. So it says, Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies, the God of all comfort. God comforts us in all our tribulation. Point people back to the comforting God. And, brethren, friends, be a comforter. Be a comforter. Learn more about comforting than about ruling. Learn more about comforting than overseeing and oversight and correction. Learn more about gentleness than boldness. Only use the boldness when it's necessary. Always use the gentleness. And hopefully if there's something that you don't want to feel it's your place to handle, pass it on to the God who comforts all. Again, we ran through a lot of scriptures, there's a whole lot more to be said. Comparing both messages, there is nature within us that causes us to be the way we are. Understand that about yourself. Understand that about other people. But then take on the responsibility to know that we can nurture people. Allow people to nurture you. Nurture other people. Work kindly and friendly with each other. Work responsibly with each other. Learn with love. And hopefully we can understand the combination, the contrast and the combination of nature and nurture.